Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him and came and bowed down before his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Then he returned to the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee. In the region of the Decapolis, they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears. He spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be open. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. It's interesting as we start to regain the habits of gathering weekly. We know that habits are important to a community of all sorts, to do things so that we don't have to think about it. And Jesus, over the past few weeks, has been shown to be working within the context of different communities. Communities whose habits and ways of approach were different. Some of the communities were dedicated to God. So in the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark last week, we saw Jesus struggling within his own Jewish community about who belongs and who doesn't. And then Jesus, in this week's Gospel, goes to take a vacation. He leaves Galilee so that he can have some time for himself, because he's gotten to the point of being so well known, he has no time to rest, no time to pray, no time to reflect on what the next steps of his ministry are. Now, in the first part of the gospel, we pretty much perceive that Jesus has a focused ministry to the people of Israel. He hasn't yet made a proclamation that this God who so intensely loves his people of Israel, that he constantly promises to them that he, God, will come into their midst and heal their problems, their diseases, their socio-political ills, all of those things, that he protects the widows and orphans. You heard it today in the Psalm and in the prophet Isaiah. And so that was his focused ministry. And he comes into this region of Tyre and Sidon, which is northeast of Galilee. And it's primarily a Gentile region. And that's an important thing. You know, if you were trying to get away from the people of Great Falls because you were such a popular person, you would probably want a vacation outside of Great Falls. You wouldn't look for a retreat right in the middle of the town center. And that's something like Jesus was doing. He was trying to get out of all of this, possibly so he could hear and see. And yet, his reputation has gone before him, a reputation that means even the Gentiles heard about him. And so he goes into this region of Tyre and Sidon, and a woman of Syrophoenician descent has heard about him, and she has a daughter possessed by a demon. So the earliest healings, the earliest acts of Jesus are in fact exorcisms, not healings. And so his reputation preceded him, and she seeks him out. She wants her daughter dispossessed of this demon, and she asks Jesus to exorcise her daughter. And Jesus is, he's not in an attitude of reception, shall we say. He doesn't receive the Syrophoenician woman like, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. He says, maybe we shouldn't, the children of Israel need to be fed first. And when he expresses that thought, I just need you all to know that there had been a long-run dissension and tension between the people of Israel and the people of Syrophoenician background. They had a history that wasn't particularly good. And they, as we saw, you may not have. The people who were reading the Daily Office this past year are getting into all of the goings-on between the people of Israel and the people that surrounded them as they became a nation. And the Phoenicians were part of that group, and they were considered not particularly savory character. They didn't worship right, they didn't worship the right God, and they were problematic. And here's Jesus dealing with a woman. In first century, it's been hundreds of years since the nation of Israel had even been a nation and been fighting with it. So clearly humans have long memories, and if you think people are going to forget something from 500 years ago, not easily. And so there's still this tension going on between Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, and yet that God who we hear enters into our world, somehow gets the message across to this Syrophoenician woman, press Jesus. Press him. She goes and says, even the dogs, and by the way, he called her a dog, even the dogs get the crumbs under the table. Now, I've told you about a friend that I have who is local, and we sometimes break bread together. And this observation that this friend of mine has, he's read the Bible, was thinking when he read the Bible front to back, starting with Genesis, great, I'm out of the Old Testament, I'm into the New Testament. And then he was like, oh my God, the New Testament is still pretty break bad, just like the Old Testament. And this particular story is like that. This is not sweet, fluffy Jesus going out among the sheep and treating them nicely. He's just insulted a woman pretty severely, and it took her energy to get him to realize, oh, maybe my ministry is more than just what I thought. There's a story of agency in the Bible that somehow this working between God and his grace and us and our reception is mysterious. That we as humans somehow, even if grace is underneath it all, work with God to choose grace, his favor. Because we can ignore it. This woman could have just walked away from Jesus. Lots of people he encounters could have not received what is up to them. And when you get into the book of Acts and you start dealing with lots more Gentiles, how did they know that this is what they wanted to be involved with? How did they know that the God who had been the God of Israel, who had some exclusive relationship as the world understood it with this people, now wanted to make that relationship somewhat less exclusive? Or at least enter into a relationship with other people in a different way. And that's what this is a moment about. It's a moment of revelation of Jesus. And I'm not sure he took it well. So instead of going to this woman's child and, doing the usual exorcism thing, he says, your faith has freed your daughter. Thanks, dude. You really went out of your way on that one. If anybody wants to know why I love the Gospel of Mark, as opposed to, say, the Gospel of John or Matthew and Luke, and they're each special in their own way, okay, I'll admit that, is that Mark has this intensity of our humanity that I don't know is in some of the other Gospels. In the Gospel of John, Jesus looks like he's always in control. In the Gospel of Mark, not always. It looks like, in fact, Jesus has revelation and learnings all the time. I mean, he's got to take a vacation to go get his head back together. And here's a woman challenging him with a whole new aspect of what it may mean that God has entered the world in a new way. And Jesus, like many of us, didn't necessarily take it well. Now, I'm not here to diminish what we say theologically about who Jesus is. I am here to state theologically that even though who we say Jesus is as a church is true, this human stuff is really dense and really textual. It's really got some grit to it. And even if Jesus is fully man and fully God, the fully man part is something to deal with. And the reason I love the Gospel of Mark so much is it deals with the humanness of Jesus. Now, maybe I'm misreading it, and it's just all because I'm a 21st century human being, and I just sort of don't approach Jesus the way some of the patristic fathers do. But I really think that we sometimes lose that real struggle that it must have been for Jesus to make changes and change his mind and to do some of the things that he was about to do. It was not a common thing. After he meets this woman, he goes out of his way, whether it was a ministry to more Gentiles or not, we don't know, because guess what? To go by way of Sidon from Tyre, it's not exactly on the way to Galilee. In fact, it's about another 20 miles north. So when Mark tells you he went back to Tyre and then went to Galilee by way of Sidon, it means he went out of his way to go to Sidon, where he meets the man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. My guess is, though the Bible doesn't tell you, this is another Gentile. This is someone who's from outside Jesus' primary ministry, and yet there's a call for him to act and heal. And he does so. He does so, he walks away, he does it in private. Then everybody says, well, how do we know about it? Well, private doesn't necessarily mean he was only alone with the man. Maybe Peter was there or whatever. The Gospel of Mark is supposed to have been written by John Mark, who was a relative of Peter. So maybe Peter could tell him this story. But I think the issue here is a continuation in Mark about the issue of who is in and who is out from the love of God. And that is something that I think we need to deal with a lot today. So I'm going to tell you a thing. The Diocese of Virginia is in some sort of transition period. We're looking for a new bishop. Bishop Susan was set up as somebody who was to have authority and hold a place while we figured out who we are. And some things we're learning about ourselves as a diocese are important. So I'm going to go to two sort of uncomfortable places, so I'm warning you. One is the Diocese of Virginia has a history of slavery in its background. And some of our churches have a very long history with that. They were built on land of slaveholders. They were built by slaves. And this is an issue that the diocese is trying to figure out, has this been part of our problem, that we are not a fulsome representative of the kingdom of God that exists within our territories and populations? There's going to be no easy answer to what this is about, but to begin struggling with it realistically, instead of saying, well, we're over that now, is one of the things that you're going to be hearing more about. It's going to be in the profile for the next bishop, that this is something we want to deal with, and we are going to be ready to work at it. And this is an inside-outside thing. I mean, if you think about it, you know, I will be gentle about my old parish in Bristol, Rhode Island, but they had a balcony in the back. You know who the balcony was for? It was for slaves and for other people who couldn't afford the pew rent subscription that went with being a member there. That's just a reality, and that's something that we just go, oh. So when we look at that balcony, it wasn't built for the choir. It was built to put people who were not really acceptable. Interesting concept in a church, is it not? And yet it was not uncommon. So that's one area we're going to be dealing with. The other area that I think we're dealing with is, how do we maintain our identity as Christians in a world where we're no longer the assumed fallback position of somebody we meet on the streets? So I will tell you, people's understanding of what Christianity is and who Jesus is influenced heavily in our dialogue, I think, heavily, I'll go back to that word, by Christians who are of an evangelical and very conservative sort, and conservative Roman Catholics, because they're more fun to cover for news media. And it has nothing to do with their religious attention. It has a lot to do with how their religious attention affects the political game. We're seeing that now in our public discourse. Here's what I will tell you. How do we begin to have a dialogue around a Jesus like is portrayed in Mark, who sometimes even struggles with his own understanding of his own ministry, to get it right on behalf of God, encountering a people who he thinks needs to be reconstituted and renewed, and a people who've never really known the love of the God of Israel. And I think we have a lot of work to do for people to begin to understand it. Some of that work has to do with us, just like some of the work about our background in slavery has to do with work about how we begin to deal with that legacy. The other part about it is how do we deal with the legacy of assuming that there is a thing called Christendom and that people already know a whole lot about Jesus. And how do we represent Jesus in that place? Now, I will tell you, Jesus responds two different ways today. One is, I think, a little bit, all right, your daughter's exercised. And the other was to walk with a man to give him his hearing and his speech back. Pretty quickly from, this may not be my ministry, to, oh, this is part of it too. I think our initial response when we deal with change like this is, because we don't like change. Nobody really does. I will tell you, my children and my family continue to laugh at me when I have to do transitions. I don't do transitions easily either. I've got to do a setup and think my way through it. Like going on vacation. It's the hardest thing in the world. My family's like, you're going on vacation? Yeah, but I'm not doing what I'm used to doing. I've got to change. Some of what we're talking about here is the church is now being asked to change some of its habits. Not bad change, good change. Good change so that people can know the love of God. And by the way, you are the commissioned ones to do that change. All of you. To live in this world and be the Jesuses and to be surprised by God doing new things and to then respond with grace and mercy and helpfulness. I think that's such an exciting place to be. And since there's nothing I can do about it, the world is where it is, then let's rejoice that God has given us a new way to respond. Or old ways done in new circumstances. Our job, your job, is the most important job, I think, that anybody can have, which is to convey the love of God into a world that is either not sure there's a God or isn't really sure they want to cooperate with the God that's presented. Some of that is our fault, and some of that is the challenge of understanding that we're not the center of it all. All of the stories that come together today, the story of James, the story of Isaiah, the story of Mark, is about a God who is constantly trying to get his creation, especially you and me, to understand how much he cares about it. Because God is God and he's created the universe the way we have, he's not going to fix it all by himself. He's asked us to join in him, to receive his love, and to change the world. That's pretty profound stuff. And that's why we come together each week, so that we can renew our energy, understand our God, and share in this community.